welcome to this press conference, both those of you here and those connecting online. We have with us Ms. Mariana Katzarova, who was appointed as Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation by the UN Human Rights Council on 4 April of this year. So she officially assumed her function on 1st of May. This is a new mandate, and this will be Ms. Katzarova's first encounter with the General Assembly. We will later have time for questions, but let's first hear from the expert. Ms. Katzarova, the floor is yours.
Well, maybe the best would be to go immediately into questions. You have the report, my first report in front of you. It's the first report delivered today in the afternoon in an interactive dialogue to the General Assembly as well. It's actually the first comprehensive overview of the human rights situation in the Russian Federation at the United Nations, within the United Nations system. So it's important to note that I focused on the most important at the moment issue, I think, defending the defenders. It's looking into the repression in the Russian Federation and the clampdown on civil liberties, the several important freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association, and the connection between the deteriorated human rights situation inside the country and the war against Ukraine abroad. The situation in Russia has been deteriorating maybe in the past 2 decades, but suddenly it rapidly went downhill since last February 2022, when the Russian Federation attacked Ukraine, and the war on Ukraine continues to this date. And the situation in the Russian Federation with human rights continues to deteriorate. Almost weekly, the legislature in Russia is introducing new laws or amending old laws, which are trying to further restrict the freedom of expression, any anti-war expression too, particularly dissident views that don't coincide with the official government views or the government propaganda. And under these laws, more than 20,000 people have been arbitrarily detained. These are mainly anti-war activists who participated in peaceful anti-war demonstrations against the war on Ukraine. Politically motivated persecutions have been increasing since the beginning of the war on Ukraine, and we have really heavy sentences for political opponents, for dissidents. Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, a peaceful political activist, voicing his anti-war views and dissident views, received 25 years imprisonment. And there are others, there are many more, who have been detained arbitrarily just because they were trying to exercise their peaceful views, but not coinciding with the government propaganda. There is, of course, Navalny, and there is Gorinov or Yashin. These are all political opponents to the government, charged on politically motivated charges. Journalists are not spared either. Evan Gershkovich is the first journalist since the Cold War, American Wall Street Journal reporter, who is now charged with espionage, and he's facing also very heavy punishment under the criminal code in a trial, in a process that will be close to the outside world, only because he was exercising his his right to his profession, being a journalist and a reporter. Russian journalists equally are facing, they're targeted and they're facing criminal charges. I could give an example with the most brutal attack on a female journalist, Elena Milashina, several months ago in the Chechen Republic. She's a journalist with the Novaya Gazeta. This is the newspaper whose editor-in-chief, Dmitry Muratov, received the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago. This is also the newspaper of Anna Politkovskaya, the murdered Russian journalist, who was the single voice of telling the truth about the plight of civilians during the Second Chechen War, which ended in 2009. And Politkovskaya was targeted and killed to silence her journalism. So Elena Milashina, her colleague, who was accompanied by a human rights lawyer, and they were visiting Chechnya to witness, to be monitoring court case. They were brutally attacked, and Elena Milashina's head was shaved to humiliate her as a female, as a woman, human rights defender, journalist, but also her fingers were, the assailants tried to break her fingers while saying to her, "We told you not to write about Chechnya and about human rights in Chechnya." So a criminal case was opened in this case, but still nobody has seen justice. The two victims haven't seen justice for this brutal attack. And it actually shows rampant impunity in Russia, and in particularly in the Chechen Republic as well, against human rights defenders and journalists. Essentially, in Russia, the civic space has been closed down by the authorities through this draconian use of legislation. Human rights organizations has been closed down, even as famous ones as Memorial, the Nobel Peace Prize winner organization, the Moscow Helsinki Group, even the Sakharov Center. More than 600 civil society organizations were targeted and forced to close by the authorities, many of them being designated as foreign agents. Individuals as well, more than 700 individuals have been designated foreign agents, including Dmitry Muratov, the editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta and a Nobel Prize winner. This is an attempt by the authorities to actually silence any criticism or any human rights work by civil society, by independent journalists. The law on foreign agents were introduced in 2012, but we see that now, with additions to this law, there are even people in the immediate circle of somebody designated as foreign agent or an organization. There is an additional charge, and it's under the influence of foreign agents or under the influence of undesirable organizations. I tried to document in my first report the growing repression against civil society, independent media, political opponents, the use of torture, including rape against men and women, anti-war activists or cultural figures, only because somebody allowed himself to publicly read his poem against the war on Ukraine. Cultural figures are also persecuted there for voicing their anti-war criticism. So many of them are in exile. Similarly with journalists, more than 1,000 independent journalists left Russia, many of them trying to work from abroad and still continuing their work. Same with human rights defenders. I have a set of recommendations to the government, which I hope the Russian authorities would follow and implement, because the Russian Federation is an important player at the United Nations. It's a member of the Security Council. It should be giving an example of observance of human rights of its own people, of the Russian people. to others in the world and to other members of the United Nations. So I hope the Russian government will revise its view of not recognizing my mandate. I very much hope they will engage in discussion with my mandate, even if this discussion is probably going to be difficult at first, because this is the first mandate, shedding light on the internal situation of human rights in one of the big P5 countries, the permanent members of the Security Council. And it's an important mandate because I think it shows how nobody is above the rules of the United Nations, even the big permanent members of the United Nations. I will stop here and I will welcome any questions online or in the room. I just need to say it is unfortunate that human rights in Russia is not gathering a huge crowd of people today in this room. It only shows the state of our world. We go through fashions of crises, and the crisis of human rights in Russia, and unfortunately the continuing brutal attack on Ukraine is not in fashion today, judging by the number of attendees to this press briefing. But we continue our work, and we continue to continue the hard work of reminding governments, the society, and the Russian people, first of all, that they're not alone. This mandate has been adopted in order to be the voice of the Russian people to the international community, to the United Nations. We continue our hard work of exposing human rights violations and, I hope, offering the government and other stakeholders to engage in a constructive dialogue, because the Russian people deserve nothing less, the Ukrainian people, the neighboring country, deserve nothing less but Russia to be a country of human rights observance, because the two countries, beyond the war that at the moment is taking so many civilian lives, beyond the war, these are two countries next to each other, and I hope Russia will be an example of a human rights observance. At least we will make sure to take it closer to that moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Katzarova. So we'll open it to questions. In the room or any questions online?
No questions.
You have a question? Yes, go ahead, please.
National News Agency of Ukraine, Volodymyr Ichenko. Thank you very much. Have you ever visited Russia? And do Russian authorities allow you to visit the country now?
No, the Russian authorities are not allowing me to visit the Russian Federation. I have officially requested a visit immediately on the second day after I assumed my post, my role, on 1st of May. I sent a letter to the Russian authorities requesting such country visit, because I think it's extremely important with such mandates, me as an independent expert, that I engage with everybody in the Russian society, from the victims of human rights violations, their lawyers, the civil society, to, of course, the government, the criminal justice officials, the ombudsperson for human rights, the judiciary. I believe that the role of a special rapporteur is to ring a bell about violations, to ring a bell about violating or not upholding the international law, the conventions of the United Nations that prescribe human rights observance. So my role is to give recommendations, but the role of the government is to actually engage with me. And actually, this would be a much better situation for the Russian authorities to have a dialogue with my mandate, to have a constructive engagement, to allow me to the country. instead of having such an oppositional attitude that they are not recognizing the decision of their peers. It's not me, obviously, who appointed myself and gave birth to this mandate. It was the member states, members of the Human Rights Council. So by not recognizing my mandate and abstracting my work, the Russian government is hoping probably to perpetuate the success of exposing the human rights violations in their country. However, this is unsuccessful so far. I commend the brave Russian people, activists, civil society, victims of human rights violations, lawyers, journalists, that sometimes risking their well-being, their their safety, they have come forward to communicate with my mandate, to meet with me, and I have been taking, of course, precaution, because I know that retaliation against anybody who will allow themselves to give the truthful information about what's happening in Russia, they could be facing danger, and they are facing danger. So a lot of people came out of Russia to meet with me and my mandate to inform the preparation of this report. I have not revealed their identity for their safety. Please go ahead.
No, about the names, the identity. But maybe you called some names of the organizations that you met with abroad to draw your report.
I mean, I could name many organizations. All of them are forced to close down in the Russian Federation. Many of them are functioning abroad. My call to many other member states, apart from the Russian Federation, has been to really engage with the Russian human rights activists and human rights defenders abroad in their countries who are now in exile, because they're trying really to continue their work. Some activists are continuing to work inside Russia in a confidential, clandestine fashion. I think it's very important that they're able abroad as well to set up their organizations. And that's not always happening in all countries. Because Russian human rights defenders are also Russian citizens. Some governments have chosen to apply a blanket approach to all Russian citizens, perpetrators of human rights violations or brave human rights defenders. And they're not even allowing them to enter their countries, let alone to allow them to set up their human rights organizations in exile. I think this needs to change. We cannot isolate the Russian, particularly the Russian human rights defenders and journalists and dissidents who bravely want to continue to expose the truth about what's happening in their country, really risking their lives. I wouldn't go into naming all the organizations because, first of all, I will miss somebody, and that would be probably detrimental. Secondly, for their protection, I cannot mention all of them. But of course, you can go to the list of more than 600 organizations and be sure that I have heard at least from half of them or a big part of them. I received, as I said, whether I mentioned or not, but I received and communicated with more than 200 sources for the preparation of this report. So it's 1/3 of the closed organizations, but also it was individuals, victims, as I said, lawyers. I'm often asked whether I trust this information. I have worked on this region and on human rights in Russia as well for most of my life. I was, before this post, I was for a year leading the High Commissioner for Human Rights mandate, investigative mandate, accountability mandate on Belarus. I know how to establish and investigate and recognize the true information from fake information. Although my mandate is not investigatory mandate, this is a special rapporteur mandate. It's, as I said, to ring the bell, to uphold the principles of international law. But I do apply the precaution in communicating with victims and witnesses. I do apply some of the techniques of verifying what information I'm receiving and by whom. So I trust the information in my report is absolutely truthful.
Maybe you can tell us in which country you met with those people. Is it the USA, European countries? Maybe you met them in Ukraine.
I haven't met, the Russian activists in Ukraine, no, because I think, first of all, I haven't visited Ukraine in my capacity as a special rapporteur. I spent in Ukraine 2 years in Donetsk in 2014, 2016, as I was leading the team of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission at the beginning of the conflict, of the armed conflict in Ukraine in 2014. And I was there when the war, in a way, began, before the full-scale attack on Ukraine last February. So I could say I know, from first-hand experience, the nature and the brutality of the war in Ukraine. Of course, we cannot compare phases of the armed conflict, but I think, of course, since the full-scale attack on Ukraine, the whole of Ukraine was a target, not just Donbas region. So no, I met human rights activists in European countries, yes, definitely. And I will continue to do so. My resolution of my mandate is asking of me, is requiring that I continue meeting with the Russian diaspora and Russian people inside and outside the Russian Federation. And a lot of, as we know, a lot of dissidents, a lot of human rights defenders are now abroad. They're in exile because they're facing imprisonment inside Russia.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see if there are any questions online. I do not see any. So I think also we are aware that Ms. Katzarova has to be at the third committee shortly. So I think we will stop it there. But if you have any questions, you can direct them to OHCHR New York office, and we will put you in contact. Thank you very much, and that concludes the press conference.
Thank you.